In today's Elden Ring video, we'll take a look at a level 150 Moonveil build for endgame and New Game Plus. I didn't want to solely rely on the Moonveil katana because I know a lot of people kinda hate that in PvP, even though that is a part of the build. Still, instead of that, I wanted to go with a moon kind of frostbite theme and create something around that, which is why I've also included a really awesome spell in the mix, but it also leaves room for a lot of spell casting, not just using the katana, so let's begin. By the way, today's video has been brought to you thanks to Instant Gaming. If you want to buy games super cheap, definitely check out their website using my links down below. You can get Elden Ring like 28% cheaper right now, or Lego Star Wars 24% cheaper, but obviously there's other discounts on the website. We're also doing a ton of giveaways, so if you want to check all of that out, use the links down below or in the pinned comment. Now, the build makes use of the Moonveil in the right hand and the Carrion Regal Scepter in the left hand, which we'll use mainly to cast additional spells, including the Adula's Moonblade. That's basically our burst of damage. Meanwhile, the Moonveil, while still strong way into the late game, won't necessarily be our burst of damage anymore. That's gonna be on the Adula's Moonblade, but it's still a great way and usually stuns anything in no more than 3 shots, which also leaves a lot of room for stunning these enemies and then setting them up with the Adula's Moonblade for maximum damage. And in the meantime, if you don't fight bosses, it's a good way to clear out trash mobs really easily with relatively low mana consumption. The Carrion Regal Scepter, on the other hand, provides the best sorcery scaling at the 80 intelligence that we have with this build, and it doesn't have to sacrifice any FP cost like some of the other staffs in the game. As I've said, the Moonveil is no longer the centerpiece of this build, but rather Adula's Moonblade, and I recently covered this in a previous video. The sorcery is extremely strong, even stronger actually after the test that I'm also going to feature in this video. So the Moonblade, or the Adula's Moonblade, is pretty similar to the Carrion Slicers, except it also throws a frost projectiles that builds frostbite. This is what makes it so powerful, is the ability to kinda do all of this at once, but more important, you can actually hit the same target multiple times in just one attack when you hold it, especially in the left hand, which would definitely will, because that's exactly the setup we're going with the Moonveil Frostblade. When you launch the Moonblade at any enemy, especially large ones, you can hit it twice, even 3 times with just the first projectile, which means quickly building up frostbite, providing a huge burst of damage, and of course also a major debuff to the enemy's resistances. That being said, there is a way to always double hit with just one cast 100% of the time, regardless of the enemy's size, and I'll give a huge shout out to Minyo and Ezekiel for pointing this out in the last video. But basically, if you hit any enemy with the tip of the sword, you do 2 attacks at the same time, one directly from the magic sword and another one from the projectile itself that launches immediately from it. And after doing some testing, I've actually come to find out that the hitbox on these is way more permissive than I thought, and you can actually still double hit the target even if, technically speaking, you're not hitting it with the tip of the sword and you're way closer to it. As long as any part of the sword and any part of the projectile hit inside of the enemy, you're still going to deal that double damage, which usually still happens because the projectile spawns as an arc rather than a straight line. This also brings us to the item overview. So in terms of weapons, as I've said, we're making use of the Moonveil and the Regal Scepter, but I've also come to find out that the Sword of Milos kind of fits quite well with this build, even if you don't meet its minimum requirements. We're using it as an offense, the Moonveil, especially since it provides about 5 FP per kill, so you don't have to regenerate FP that often with potions. I've actually run a bunch of tests between the sword, the Ancestral Horns Talisman, and the Filigree Crest to see which is the most efficient in terms of mana consumption, and obviously the Sword of Milos plus the Filigree Crest was the most efficient. You don't just get the 5 FP reduction to the Moonveil cost, it also essentially gives you plus 5 FP back for every kill from the sword itself. Meanwhile, the Ancestral Horns only gives like 3 FP back per kill, so it's really not that great. For the armor, I'm using an Okina mask for that additional 3 points into dexterity. You can also go with intelligence, but I wanted some extra dex to meet the minimum requirements for the Moonveil, so it helps with that. And I'm also using the Blade armor in conjunction with this. It provides great robustness, poise, and resistance, and it's really not that heavy. Now, if you do combine the Sword of Milos with the Blade armor, then you are going to start fat rolling, point at which I recommend switching to the fingerprint armor, or at least a part of the fingerprint armor set, since that's way less heavy and still provides some great resistances very close to the Blight armor. In terms of talismans, obviously the Shard of Alexander and the Magic Scorpion Charm provide an additional 27% damage increase to the Moonveil, and you also get to benefit from the Magic Scorpion Charm for that Moonblade that you're casting from the left hand. Meanwhile, I'm using the Marika's Source Seal for the extra points, though I will say the Radagons would be much better here since it affects 3 important attributes instead of just 2 with the Marikas, and you can then just focus those points into reaching 80 into intelligence. For some of the other ones, for the final slot, there's a few options. You can obviously go with the Carrion Filigree Crest. As I've said, it reduces that FP cost of the Moonveil attacks by about 5 FP for the heavy attack. You can also get a Graven Mass Talisman, about 8% damage increase to your sorceries if you want to focus a bit more on the sorceries, or maybe a Turtle Talisman or Earth Tree Talisman +2 for a better stamina recovery or more stamina and equip load. Again, it depends on your preferences. Now, in terms of the strategy, this is a pretty versatile build, so you can start with either Moonveil or Moonblade depending on the boss and enemy, but here are my recommendations. Against larger, slower bosses that you can initiate the fight against, I recommend starting with the Moonblade, unleash one, step back, and then unleash another Moonblade again. This is going to provide about 4 hits into one, which will definitely proc a Frostbite for a huge burst of damage and those, well, defense reductions, and then you can unleash the Moonveil attacks for more damage and of course also a stun. On the other hand, if you're fighting against more agile enemies that you can't keep a hold of with the Moonblade, what you can do is to open up with the Moonveil Katana and aim to stun them, which should happen within 3 to 4 hits at the maximum. And then what you want to do is to just align the longest part of their body so that you can unleash a Moonblade and hit that hitbox as many times as possible for maximum damage. In both of these situations, I definitely do not recommend to chain the Adula's Moonblade, even though that sounds kinda counterintuitive. Reason being is because only the initial cast on the Moonblade deals double hits and not the subsequent ones. So instead, what I recommend is to hit once, step back, and then hit once again. This is going to ensure dealing the maximum damage possible. For smaller enemies, this is going to still be devastating, but for extra large ones like some of these dragons, it literally means one-shotting them. Especially against some of these dragons, if you fully align their entire body, you can unleash a Moonblade, and assuming that you also ensure the first 2 hits to happen, you will perform like 4 or 5 with one single attack as it travels through the enemy's body. So yeah, that's usually a one-shot for some of these bigger, larger hitbox enemies. In terms of the stats, by the way, as I've said on the final note, this is going to be an 80 intelligence build. We're gonna mainly focus on sorceries and the sorcery portion or the skill portion of the Moonveil, since that's gonna deal the highest amount of damage. I've also invested about 45 points into Vigor. We're quite close to the enemy usually, so in case anything bad happens, you might want to face tank that just in case and not die in one shot. And then of course the FP was also another big point. You do want to get as close as possible to 200 FP since this is a pretty mana hungry build, and these spells can consume mana quite fast since they are quite spammable. So this is it pretty much with it. Yeah, let me know down below what you think of it, if you tested it or if you're using a similar setup, and I'll see you guys in the next video.